Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that their betrayal didn't just break your heart, it almost destroyed your soul? What if I told you that sometimes, the people who hurt us the most aren't strangers in dark alleys, but the ones who sit across from us at dinner tables, who know our fears, our dreams, our weaknesses? What if I told you that revenge, when it comes, doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning? Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits 9 years. And sometimes, it costs $200 million. My name is Sarah Chen, and this is the story of how I learned that in the world of corporate power, trust is a luxury you can't afford, love is a weapon that can be turned against you, and patience is the difference between justice and destruction. This is the story of how one man's lie in front of 12 directors didn't just humiliate me. It ended his career, froze a fortune, and taught me that sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served legal. But to understand how it all ended, you need to know how it all began. You need to know about the woman I used to be, before I learned that the people we love the most are often the ones positioned perfectly to hurt us the deepest. 10 years ago, I was 32 years old, standing in the lobby of Morrison Financial Group, clutching a briefcase and wearing my best interview suit. The one I'd bought with my last credit card, because after 18 months of unemployment following the banking crisis, this job interview was my final shot at redemption. I'd lost my previous position at Goldman Sachs not because I was incompetent, but because I'd refused to sign off on a derivatives package I knew was toxic. Whistleblowing, they called it. Career suicide, my colleagues whispered. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, and I walked into what would become my battlefield for the next decade. Glass offices stretched endlessly, filled with people in expensive suits making decisions that moved millions of dollars with a single signature. The air smelled like leather, ambition, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something that, years later, I would recognize as fear. Ms. Chen. The receptionist's voice cut through my thoughts. Mr. Morrison is ready to see you. James Morrison. Even his name carried weight in those days. 6'2", silver-haired, with eyes that seemed to see straight through you. He'd built Morrison Financial from nothing into a billion-dollar empire, and everyone knew his story. Poor kid from Detroit, worked 3 jobs to put himself through Harvard Business School, clawed his way to the top through sheer determination and brilliant financial instincts. What they didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that James Morrison was also one of the most dangerous men I would ever meet. Not because he carried weapons or made threats, but because he had perfected the art of making people believe he cared about them while systematically positioning them for destruction. Sarah, he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk as I entered his office. I've been looking forward to this conversation. The interview lasted 3 hours. We talked about market volatility, regulatory frameworks, risk assessment protocols. But more than that, we talked about trust. About building something lasting in a world where everything seemed designed to crumble. He listened to my story about Goldman Sachs, about why I'd chosen integrity over job security, and instead of seeing weakness, he claimed to see strength. This industry needs more people like you, he told me as the sun set over Manhattan outside his corner office windows. People who understand that sometimes doing the right thing costs us everything in the short term, but saves us everything in the long term. I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. He offered me the position of Senior Compliance Officer on the spot. Not just any position, but one of the most critical roles in the entire organization. The person responsible for ensuring that every contract, every deal, every financial instrument we created would stand up to regulatory scrutiny. The person who would build the legal framework that would protect the company from the kind of scandals that had destroyed other firms during the crisis. I need someone I can trust completely, he said, shaking my hand. Someone who will tell me the truth even when it's not what I want to hear. Especially when it's not what I want to hear. I walked out of that office feeling like I could conquer the world. Finally, a leader who understood that compliance wasn't just about avoiding lawsuits, it was about building sustainable business practices. Finally, a company where my skills would be valued instead of feared. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that James Morrison had already decided I was the perfect fall guy for what he was planning. He didn't hire me despite my history of whistleblowing. He hired me because of it. Because he needed someone with an unshakable reputation for integrity to give legitimacy to what he was about to do. My first 2 years at Morrison Financial were everything I'd hoped they would be. I threw myself into the work with the passion of someone who'd found their calling. I redesigned our entire compliance framework from the ground up, creating safeguards and protocols that were so thorough, so airtight, that other firms began hiring our consultants to implement similar systems. The Morrison Compliance Framework, they called it in industry publications. My framework, though my name rarely appeared in the articles. I didn't care about the credit. I cared about the work. I cared about building something that would protect investors, employees, shareholders. Something that would prevent the kind of catastrophic failures that had destroyed so many lives during the financial crisis. But more than the professional satisfaction, I found something I hadn't expected to find in that glass tower. I found a family. It started innocently enough. Late nights working on complex regulatory filings. James would order dinner for the team, and we'd sit around the conference table, going over legal language and risk assessments until midnight. These weren't just business meetings. They were collaborations between people who genuinely seemed to care about each other's success. James had a way of making everyone feel essential. He remembered personal details, asked about family members, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. When my mother was diagnosed with cancer, he gave me unlimited time off and made sure my health insurance covered her experimental treatments. When I finally returned to work 6 months later, there was a handwritten note on my desk. Family first, always. The company will survive without you for as long as you need. Your mother won't. Take care of what matters most. James. I kept that note in my desk drawer for years. Even after everything that happened, even after I learned the truth about his motivations, I kept it. Because in that moment, it felt genuine. In that moment, I believed I was working for someone who saw me as more than just an employee. The professional relationship evolved into something more personal over the following months. Not romantic, never romantic, but something deeper in some ways. A mentorship that felt like kinship. James began including me in high-level strategic meetings, asking for my input on decisions that went far beyond compliance issues. He introduced me to his family, invited me to his daughter's wedding, made me feel like I belonged in his world. "You remind me of myself at your age," he told me one evening as we worked late on a particularly complex merger deal. "Hungry, principled, unafraid to fight for what's right. The difference is, you're smarter than I ever was." I laughed off the compliment, but privately, I treasured it. Here was one of the most successful men in finance, someone whose opinion carried weight on Wall Street, telling me I had what it took to succeed at the highest levels. For someone who'd spent years feeling like an outsider, like a troublemaker, those words were intoxicating. But before I tell you about the night that changed everything, before I reveal the moment when James Morrison showed me his true face, I need you to understand something. Make sure to subscribe and like this video so you don't miss what happens next. Because what you're about to hear will change everything you think you know about trust, about loyalty, about the price of believing in people who see your faith as a weapon to be used against you. The third year was when things began to change, though I was too blind to see the signs. Too invested in believing that I had found my place in the world to recognize that I was being systematically isolated and positioned for something terrible. It started with small things. Meetings I wasn't invited to that I normally would have attended. Documents that required my compliance review being handled by external consultants instead. James's explanations were always reasonable, always delivered with that warm smile and personal attention that made me feel special. "I'm trying to reduce your workload, Sarah. You've been carrying too much of the burden around here. Let the consultants handle the routine stuff so you can focus on the big picture strategic issues." I should have questioned it. I should have wondered why the person responsible for ensuring regulatory compliance was being excluded from compliance reviews. But I trusted him. More than trusted him, I believed in him. I believed in the vision he'd shared with me of building a company that would set new standards for ethical business practices in the financial sector. The isolation became more pronounced as the months passed. My team was gradually reassigned to other projects. My access to certain systems was quietly restricted, always with explanations that seemed reasonable at the time. I was being slowly, carefully separated from the day-to-day operations of the company, though I was told it was because I was being groomed for bigger things. "I'm considering you for a board position, Sarah," James confided in me during one of our private dinners. "But I need you to understand the broader strategic picture before you can be effective at that level. Trust me to handle the operational details while you focus on the vision." Looking back, I can see how perfectly orchestrated it all was. How every move was calculated to make me complicit while keeping me ignorant. How he used my own principles and ambitions against me, turning my desire to do meaningful work into a blindness that nearly destroyed me. The warning signs were there, but they were mixed in with so much genuine-seeming care and attention that I dismissed them. When other employees started avoiding me, I told myself it was professional jealousy. When old colleagues stopped returning my calls, I assumed they were busy with their own careers. When industry contacts began treating me differently at conferences and networking events, I thought it was because I was moving in higher circles now, becoming someone they saw as out of their league. I was wrong about all of it. But I wouldn't understand just how wrong until the night James Morrison invited me to what he called a celebration dinner, and I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones who have been planning your destruction from the very beginning. October 15th. I remember the date because it was exactly 3 years from the day I'd been hired. James had made reservations at Le Bernardin, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan. "To celebrate your anniversary with the firm," he'd said, "and to discuss your future." I wore my best dress, the navy blue Armani I'd bought to celebrate my first successful year at Morrison Financial. I felt sophisticated, confident, ready to hear about whatever new opportunity he wanted to offer me. Ready to take the next step in what I believed was a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. The restaurant was dimly lit, elegant, intimate. James had requested a private table in the back, away from other diners. "So we can talk freely," he'd explained. I should have wondered what kind of business conversation required such privacy, but I was too excited about the possibilities to think critically. We ordered wine, an expensive Burgundy that James insisted on selecting. We talked about the company's recent successes, about the industry recognition our compliance framework had received, about the bright future that lay ahead. Everything felt normal, celebratory even, until the moment James's expression changed. "Sarah," he said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before. Colder. More calculating. "There's something we need to discuss. Something about your future with the company." My heart began to race, but not with excitement anymore. Something in his eyes had shifted, something that made the expensive wine suddenly taste bitter in my mouth. "I've been having some concerns about your work lately. About your judgment." I stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" "My performance reviews have been excellent. The compliance framework is working perfectly. We haven't had a single regulatory issue in 3 years." He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass with deliberate slowness. "That's exactly the problem, Sarah. You've become too rigid, too focused on rules instead of results. In this business, sometimes you need to be willing to take calculated risks, to work in the gray areas. But you've lost that flexibility. James, I don't understand. You hired me specifically because of my approach to compliance. You said you valued integrity above everything else." His smile was cold now, nothing like the warm expression I'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. "I said a lot of things, Sarah. But circumstances change. Business needs evolve. And frankly, your approach is starting to hold us back from opportunities that could be incredibly profitable." The words hit me like physical blows. This was the man who had written me a note about family first, who had claimed to value my principles, who had made me believe that we were building something meaningful together. And now he was telling me that everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, was actually a hindrance to his real goals. "What exactly are you saying?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "I'm saying that maybe it's time for you to consider other opportunities. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous severance package, 6 months' salary, excellent references. You could easily find another position at a firm that's more aligned with your particular approach to business. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I couldn't speak. This wasn't just about losing a job. This was about having the foundation of everything I believed about professional relationships torn away in a single conversation. "You're firing me," I said finally. "I'm giving you an opportunity to leave with dignity and excellent references. The alternative." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The alternative might be more difficult for everyone involved. That's when I understood. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was the culmination of months, maybe years of planning. The isolation, the reassignments, the gradual separation from day-to-day operations. He'd been preparing for this moment, positioning me so that my departure would seem natural, unavoidable. But there was something else in his tone, something that suggested this conversation wasn't really about my performance at all. This was about something bigger, something he wasn't telling me. "What aren't you saying, James? What's really going on here?" For just a moment, his mask slipped completely. The warmth, the paternal concern, the professional respect. All of it disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory. "What's going on, Sarah, is that you're in the way. You've built a compliance framework that's so thorough, so transparent, that it's going to prevent us from pursuing some very lucrative opportunities. Opportunities that could make this company, and everyone in it, incredibly wealthy. Opportunities that violate regulations," I said, the pieces finally falling into place. "Opportunities that exist in regulatory gray areas," he corrected. "Areas where your rigid interpretation of the rules would prevent us from acting in our shareholders' best interests." I felt sick. Literally nauseated. Everything I had built, everything I had worked for, had been designed not to protect the company from regulatory violations, but to provide cover for them. He had hired me, cultivated me, positioned me as the face of ethical business practices, so that when the time came to circumvent those very practices, my reputation would provide camouflage for his true intentions. "I won't be part of this," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Whatever you're planning, I won't help you do it." "You won't have to," he replied. "Because as of tomorrow morning, you'll no longer work here. The question is whether you leave quietly, with generous compensation and excellent references, or whether this becomes complicated." The threat was unmistakable. Sign the severance agreement, keep quiet about whatever I suspected, and walk away with my reputation intact. Or fight him, and face the consequences. "I need time to think about this," I said, standing on legs that felt unsteady. "Of course. But Sarah..." He stood as well, placing a hand on my shoulder in a gesture that once would have felt paternal but now felt threatening. "Don't think too long. Some opportunities have expiration dates." I walked out of that restaurant feeling like a stranger in my own life. The woman who had entered Le Bernardin 3 hours earlier no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone who understood that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, that loyalty was a weakness that could be weaponized, and that the people who claim to care about you are often the ones positioned perfectly to destroy you. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have imagined, was that James Morrison had underestimated me in the most catastrophic way possible. He thought he was dismissing an inconvenient compliance officer. What he was actually doing was creating his own destroyer. But first, I had to survive what he was about to do to me. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment overlooking Central Park, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had happened. The conversation at Le Bernardin felt like a nightmare, something too surreal to be real. But the sick feeling in my stomach and the stack of legal documents that had been messengered to my apartment at 7 a.m. confirmed that it wasn't a dream. Severance agreement. Non-disclosure agreement. Non-compete clause. Everything designed to ensure my silence and compliance with James Morrison's vision for my departure. Generous terms, as he had promised. 6 months salary, health benefits continuation, stellar reference letters already prepared and signed. All I had to do was sign away my right to ever speak about what I had seen, what I had built, what I suspected was coming. All I had to do was pretend that the past 3 years had been exactly what they appeared to be on the surface, and walk away quietly into whatever future I could build from the ruins of my trust. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, reading through the legal language that would define the rest of my professional life. The non-compete was particularly vicious, preventing me from working for any financial services firm for 2 years, effectively blacklisting me from the only industry where my skills had value. That's when I realized this wasn't just about getting rid of an inconvenient employee. This was about destroying my ability to interfere with whatever James had planned. He wasn't just firing me. He was making sure I couldn't work anywhere else, couldn't build relationships with other firms that might give me a platform to expose whatever schemes he was developing. My phone rang. James Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "Sarah, good morning. I hope you've had a chance to review the paperwork." "I'm still reading through it," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Of course. Take your time. But I wanted to let you know that I've already spoken with the team about your departure. We're announcing it this afternoon as a mutual decision, a natural career transition as you move on to bigger opportunities." Very positive, very respectful. The casual way he delivered the news that my professional life was already being rewritten without my input was breathtaking. He wasn't waiting for my signature on the severance agreement. He was proceeding as if my compliance was a foregone conclusion. "What if I don't sign?" I asked. There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. "Sarah, I really hope it doesn't come to that. For both our sakes." The line went dead. I spent the rest of the morning making phone calls. Old colleagues, industry contacts, recruiters I'd worked with in the past. Ostensibly, I was exploring my options, testing the market to see what opportunities might be available if I chose not to sign the non-compete. What I discovered was chilling. Every single contact I reached had already heard about my departure from Morrison Financial. More than heard about it, they had been given very specific information about why I was leaving. "Sarah, I'm sorry, but after what happened with the Henderson account, I don't think we can consider you for any positions," said the recruiter who had helped me find 3 previous jobs. Henderson account. I had never worked on any Henderson account. I had never even heard of it. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I said carefully. "Look, I understand these things happen. Compliance failures are part of the business. But the liability issues, the potential regulatory exposure, it's just too risky for most firms to take on someone with that kind of history." Compliance failures. Regulatory exposure. James Morrison hadn't just fired me. He had systematically destroyed my professional reputation before I'd even signed the severance agreement. He had created a narrative about my departure that made me unemployable while simultaneously making it impossible for me to defend myself without violating the non-disclosure agreement I hadn't even signed yet. It was brilliant. Absolutely, devastatingly brilliant. I called 6 more recruiters. The story was the same everywhere. Sarah Chen, former compliance officer at Morrison Financial, had been involved in some kind of regulatory failure. Details were vague, but the implications were clear. Hiring me would be a liability that no reputable firm would accept. By noon, I understood the true scope of what James had done to me. This wasn't just about removing me from Morrison Financial. This was about making sure I could never work in the financial industry again. This was about transforming me from a respected professional into a cautionary tale, a reminder to others about what happened when you got in James Morrison's way. I could sign the severance agreement, take the money, and try to build a new life in some other industry. Or I could fight, knowing that he held all the cards, controlled all the narratives, and had the resources to destroy whatever was left of my reputation. But there was a third option. One that James Morrison, in his arrogance and his certainty that he had already won, hadn't considered. I could disappear. Not literally, of course. But professionally, socially, I could step back from the world that James Morrison controlled and use the time to understand exactly what he was planning. Because whatever scheme required my removal was big enough, complex enough, that he had been willing to invest 3 years in positioning me for destruction. And if it was that important to him, then understanding it might be the key to my salvation. I spent the next 3 days doing something I had never done in my professional life. I lied. I called James's office and left a message with his assistant saying I was ready to sign the severance agreement, that I would be in the office on Friday morning to finalize everything. Then I called in sick to my own job, claiming a family emergency that would keep me away for the rest of the week. During those 3 days, I became a detective in my own professional life. I used my administrative access, which hadn't been revoked yet, to dig through Morrison Financial's files and systems. Not to steal proprietary information or violate any laws, but to understand what had been happening in the company while I was being systematically isolated from operations. What I found was a pattern of activity that should have required compliance review but had been handled through external consultants instead. Merger discussions, acquisition proposals, complex financial instruments that pushed the boundaries of regulatory frameworks. All perfectly legal, as far as I could tell, but all structured in ways that maximized profit while minimizing transparency. And then I found the Morrison Offshore Holdings file. It was buried deep in the system, accessible only through administrative privileges that most employees didn't have. A complex network of shell companies and international partnerships that seemed designed to move money through jurisdictions with minimal regulatory oversight. Again, not necessarily illegal, but structured in ways that would be difficult for regulators to trace or monitor. The scope of it was breathtaking. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through entities in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore. All perfectly documented, all technically compliant with international banking regulations, but all designed to exist in the grey areas that James had mentioned during our dinner. This was what he had been building while I was focused on domestic compliance frameworks. This was why my rigid adherence to regulatory transparency had become an obstacle to his vision. My compliance systems were designed to create transparency, to ensure that every transaction could be traced and justified to regulators. But his offshore network was designed for the opposite purpose, to create legitimate obscurity, to make it impossible for anyone to understand the true scope and purpose of Morrison Financial's international activities. And then I found the timeline. According to the documents I was reading, the offshore network was scheduled to become operational within 60 days. Major capital transfers were planned, complex investment strategies that would move enormous sums of money through the network James had created. Nothing obviously illegal, but everything structured to exist in regulatory blind spots that my domestic compliance framework couldn't monitor. I finally understood why my departure had been so carefully orchestrated. James Morrison wasn't just planning to circumvent regulations. He was planning to create a parallel financial empire that would operate beyond the reach of the very compliance systems I had built to protect Morrison Financial. But there was something else in the files, something that made me realize just how perfectly James had positioned me for destruction. Every document related to the offshore network contained a single line of text at the bottom: Compliance Framework Approval, S. Chen, Senior Compliance Officer. My digital signature. My approval. My responsibility. James Morrison hadn't just fired me to get me out of the way. He had spent 3 years making me complicit in a scheme I knew nothing about. Every system I had built, every protocol I had implemented, every safeguard I had designed had been reverse-engineered to provide cover for activities I had never reviewed or approved. When the offshore network became operational, when regulators eventually began asking questions about Morrison Financial's international activities, every investigation would lead back to the compliance framework. To my framework. To my digital signature on documents I had never seen, approving activities I had never reviewed. I was supposed to be the fall guy. That Friday morning, I walked into Morrison Financial's offices for what I knew would be the last time. But I wasn't the same woman who had been devastated by James Morrison's betrayal 3 days earlier. I was someone who understood exactly what kind of war I was fighting, and what weapons my enemy had already deployed against me. James was waiting in his office, the severance agreement spread across his mahogany desk like a treaty ending a war he thought he had already won. "Sarah, you look well. I hope you've had time to consider everything we discussed." I sat down across from him, studying his face. The paternal warmth was back, the careful concern for my well-being. He was performing the role of the benevolent leader again, the mentor who was sadly but necessarily making a difficult decision for the good of the company. I said. "And I need to ask you something before I sign." "Of course. The offshore holdings network. When were you planning to tell me about it?" For just a moment, his composure cracked. The mask slipped, and I saw surprise, calculation, and something that might have been fear flicker across his features. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said, but his voice was different now. More careful. The shell companies in the Cayman Islands. The Swiss partnerships. The Singapore investment vehicles. The network that's been under development for the past 18 months while I was being excluded from compliance reviews. He was silent for a long moment, studying me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex problem. "Sarah, I think you may have misunderstood some documents you shouldn't have been accessing. Documents that carry my digital signature approving activities I never reviewed." The silence stretched between us like a weapon. James Morrison was realizing that the woman sitting across from him was not the defeated, grateful employee he had expected to see. She was someone who had discovered his plan, understood her role in it, and was now holding cards he didn't know she possessed. "What do you want?" he asked finally. It was the first completely honest thing he had said to me in 3 years. "I want the truth," I said. "I want to know exactly what you've been planning, what role you intended me to play in it, and what you think happens next." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I had known him, James Morrison looked like someone who had been outmaneuvered. "You were never supposed to find out about any of this," he said. "You were supposed to sign the severance agreement, take the money, and disappear quietly. The offshore network would become operational, you would be gone, and if anyone ever asked questions about compliance oversight, you would be unavailable for comment due to the non-disclosure agreement. And if regulators traced the approvals back to me, you would be a former employee who had been terminated for performance issues. Someone whose judgment had been questioned, whose reliability was suspect. Someone who couldn't defend herself because of legal agreements that prevented her from discussing her work at Morrison Financial." The cold calculation of it was breathtaking. He had built a plan that would not just remove me as an obstacle, but would transform me into a shield that would protect him from regulatory scrutiny while simultaneously making it impossible for me to expose what he was doing. "But now that you know," he continued, "we have a different situation. One that's more complicated for both of us." "What does that mean?" James Morrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Manhattan spread below us. When he turned back to me, the paternal mask was completely gone. What remained was a man who had built an empire through ruthless calculation and was now facing the first real threat to his power he had encountered in years. "It means, Sarah, that you have 2 choices. You can sign the severance agreement, take the money, and trust that I'll honor our understanding about what should and shouldn't be discussed. Or," he paused, letting the implication hang in the air, "or what? Or you can try to expose what you think you've discovered, and learn exactly how much power I have to destroy people who try to interfere with my business." The threat was clear, but something in his tone suggested he was less confident than he was trying to appear. He had planned for a compliant departure, not for a fight. And fighting me meant taking risks he hadn't accounted for. I stood up and walked toward the door, then turned back to face him. "James, there's something you should know about me. Something you never bothered to learn during the 3 years you spent positioning me for destruction." "What's that?" "I don't scare easily. And I don't give up." I walked out of his office and out of Morrison Financial forever. But not as the defeated, humiliated woman James Morrison expected me to be. I left as someone who had seen his true face, understood his plan, and was now prepared to show him exactly what kind of enemy he had created. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that I had spent the past 3 days doing more than just discovering his offshore network. I had been preparing for a war that would take 9 years to fight, and that would end with James Morrison losing everything he had built. But first, I had to survive what he was about to do to me. The systematic destruction of my professional life began the Monday after I walked out of James Morrison's office without signing the severance agreement. It was swift, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating. By Tuesday morning, I had received calls from every financial services recruiter in Manhattan. Not to offer me opportunities, but to inform me that they would no longer be able to represent me due to concerns that had been brought to their attention regarding my professional conduct. By Wednesday, the story had spread beyond recruiting firms to industry publications. Morrison Financial parts ways with senior compliance officer following internal review, ran in Financial Times. The article was brief, professional, and utterly damning in its implications. It mentioned performance concerns and questions about judgment without providing any specific details, creating the impression that something serious had happened while leaving readers to imagine the worst. By Thursday, former colleagues who had been friends for years were no longer returning my phone calls. By Friday, I understood that James Morrison hadn't been making empty threats. He had the power to destroy reputations, to end careers, to make people disappear from the financial services industry as if they had never existed. And he was using that power to make an example of me. But the worst part wasn't the professional destruction. It was the personal isolation. I learned that James Morrison had called my mother directly, expressing his concern about my emotional stability following my departure from the firm. He had suggested that I might need professional help, that the stress of my performance issues had affected my judgment in ways that worried him as someone who cared about my well-being. My mother, already fragile from her cancer treatments and confused by my sudden career crisis, began asking if I was having some kind of breakdown. She suggested I consider therapy, maybe some time away from the city to clear my head and get some perspective. Friends became distant, not out of malice but out of uncertainty about what had really happened and whether associating with me might damage their own careers. Professional contacts stopped responding to emails. Social invitations dried up. Within 2 weeks, I had been effectively erased from the world I had inhabited for the past decade. James Morrison had turned me into a ghost, someone who existed but was no longer visible to the community that had once been my life. But isolation, I learned, can be a gift if you know how to use it. With no job prospects and no social obligations, I found myself with something I hadn't had in years: time. Time to think, to plan, to understand exactly what kind of war I was fighting and what weapons were available to me. I rented a small apartment in Brooklyn, far from the Manhattan financial district where my former life had existed. I lived carefully on my savings, avoiding the expensive restaurants and social events that had once defined my calendar. I became someone different, someone simpler, someone who could think clearly without the distractions of career ambition and social pressure. And I began to study. Not just James Morrison's offshore network, though I continued researching that through publicly available documents and international financial databases, but the man himself. His history, his methods, his previous business dealings. I wanted to understand not just what he was planning, but how he operated, what vulnerabilities he might have, what patterns of behavior I could exploit. What I discovered was that James Morrison's rise to power had left a trail of destroyed careers and ruined lives that stretched back decades. Former partners who had been systematically squeezed out of profitable deals. Employees who had been discredited and blacklisted after raising concerns about business practices. Whistleblowers who had been professionally destroyed and personally humiliated. I wasn't his first victim. I was just the latest in a long line of people who had underestimated his willingness to use their trust against them. But I was also different from his previous victims in one crucial way. I had built the compliance framework that was now being used to legitimize his offshore network. I had created the very systems he was exploiting, which meant I understood those systems better than anyone else, including James Morrison himself. And I began to see possibilities that he couldn't possibly have anticipated. The Morrison compliance framework wasn't just a set of procedures and protocols. It was a complex system of interconnected safeguards, each designed to trigger alerts and reviews when certain thresholds were crossed or when unusual patterns of activity were detected. I had built it to be comprehensive, to catch not just obvious violations but subtle manipulations that might otherwise go unnoticed. What James Morrison didn't understand was that by using my digital signature to approve activities I had never reviewed, he had created a digital trail that would eventually expose everything he was trying to hide. The system I had designed was too thorough, too intelligent, to be fooled by forged approvals and backdated authorizations. But the alerts and safeguards would only trigger when the offshore network became fully operational. When large sums of money began moving through the shell companies and international partnerships. When the activities I had supposedly approved actually began generating the kind of financial patterns that would attract regulatory attention. James Morrison thought he had neutralized the compliance framework by removing me from the company. What he had actually done was arm a weapon that would detonate the moment he tried to use the system I had built to legitimize activities I had never approved. I just had to wait. Waiting, it turned out, was the hardest part. Not just because of the isolation and the financial pressure, but because every day that passed brought new evidence of James Morrison's success and my own irrelevance. Morrison Financial's stock price climbed steadily as rumors spread about major international expansion plans. Industry publications praised James Morrison's visionary leadership and innovative approach to global financial services. He appeared on television, was quoted in newspapers, was invited to speak at conferences about the future of international banking. Meanwhile, I remained invisible. A cautionary tale whispered about in recruiting offices and corporate boardrooms. The compliance officer who had lost her judgment, who had been quietly removed from one of the most successful firms on Wall Street. But I used the time to prepare. I documented everything I had learned about the offshore network, creating a comprehensive analysis of how the shell companies were structured, how money would flow through them, how the activities would be hidden from regulatory oversight. I identified the specific points where the compliance framework would detect discrepancies between approved activities and actual transactions. Most importantly, I waited for the right moment. The moment when James Morrison would be most vulnerable, when his success would be most complete, when his downfall would have the greatest impact. That moment came exactly 18 months after I had walked out of his office, when Morrison Financial announced the largest international merger in the company's history. The headline appeared in the Wall Street Journal on a Tuesday morning: Morrison Financial to acquire European investment giant in $2.8 billion deal. The merger would create one of the largest international financial services companies in the world, with operations spanning 4 continents and assets under management exceeding $50 billion. James Morrison was quoted extensively in the article, describing his vision for global financial services and the opportunities that the merger would create for clients and shareholders alike. He was at the pinnacle of his success, the master of a financial empire that seemed poised to dominate international markets for decades to come. What the article didn't mention was that the merger would require enormous capital transfers through the offshore network James had spent 2 years building. Money would have to move through shell companies, flow through international partnerships, and be structured through the complex instruments he had created while excluding me from compliance oversight. The merger would trigger every safeguard I had built into the Morrison compliance framework. But I needed more than automated alerts and compliance violations to bring down James Morrison. I needed someone with the power and authority to act on the information I had gathered. Someone who couldn't be influenced or intimidated by his wealth and connections. I needed Catherine Rodriguez. Catherine Rodriguez was a senior prosecutor with the Securities and Exchange Commission, specializing in financial fraud and regulatory violations. I had met her 5 years earlier when she was investigating irregularities at Goldman Sachs, the same issues that had led to my departure from that firm. She had been impressed by my willingness to cooperate with the investigation, my detailed knowledge of the systems and procedures that had enabled the violations. More importantly, she was someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or influenced by the kind of power James Morrison wielded. She had built her reputation by taking on wealthy, well-connected individuals who thought they were above the law. She was exactly the kind of prosecutor who would see the Morrison offshore network not as a business opportunity but as a challenge to the regulatory framework she had devoted her career to protecting. But approaching Catherine Rodriguez required careful preparation. I couldn't simply walk into her office with allegations about a man who was being celebrated in the financial press as a visionary leader. I needed evidence, documentation, a compelling case that would justify opening an investigation into one of the most powerful figures on Wall Street. I had been building that case for 18 months. Now I needed to present it in a way that would convince a federal prosecutor to take on James Morrison at the height of his success and influence. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in Catherine's office at the SEC building in Lower Manhattan. I arrived early, carrying a briefcase filled with documents, analysis, and evidence that represented 2 years of careful research and preparation. Catherine looked older than when I had last seen her, with grey streaking through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of long nights and difficult cases. But her handshake was firm, her attention focused, her manner suggesting someone who had seen enough financial criminals to recognize the signs when she encountered them. "Sarah, it's good to see you again. Though I have to admit, I was surprised by your call. What can I do for you?" I opened my briefcase and removed the first document. A summary of Morrison Financial's offshore network that I had prepared specifically for this meeting, written in the clear, precise language that prosecutors needed to understand complex financial structures. "Catherine, I believe I have evidence that James Morrison has constructed a sophisticated network of offshore entities designed to circumvent regulatory oversight and facilitate activities that violate federal securities laws." She studied the document for several minutes, her expression growing more serious as she read. When she finished, she looked up at me with the kind of focused attention that made it clear I had her complete interest. "This is comprehensive work, Sarah. But I have to ask, how did you obtain this information? These appear to be internal documents from Morrison Financial." I had prepared for this question. "Everything I'm showing you is based on publicly available information, international corporate filings, and my own analysis of how these structures would interact with existing compliance frameworks. I haven't stolen anything or violated any confidentiality agreements." It was technically true, though it didn't mention the insights I had gained from my brief access to Morrison's internal systems. But Catherine Rodriguez was an experienced prosecutor. She understood the difference between legally obtained evidence and information that could be used to identify where legally obtained evidence might be found. "If your analysis is correct," she said, "this would represent one of the most sophisticated regulatory avoidance schemes I've seen. But it would also be incredibly difficult to prove without cooperation from someone inside Morrison Financial." "That's why I'm here," I said. "I built the compliance framework that James Morrison is using to legitimize these activities. I understand how the systems work, where the vulnerabilities are, what evidence would be generated when money starts flowing through these structures." Catherine Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, studying me with the intensity of someone evaluating a potential asset in a complex investigation. "Sarah, I have to ask you directly. What's your motivation here? You worked for James Morrison for 3 years. You built systems that, according to your own analysis, are being used to facilitate potential violations. Why are you coming to me now?" It was the question I had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. The moment when I would have to explain my own complicity, my own blindness, my own transformation from trusted employee to enemy. "Because I was set up," I said simply. "James Morrison spent 3 years positioning me to be the fall guy for activities I never approved. My digital signature is on documents I never saw, approving structures I never reviewed. When this network becomes operational and regulators start asking questions, every investigation will lead back to me. And you can prove that." I removed another set of documents from my briefcase. Technical analysis of digital signatures, timestamp records, system access logs that I had reconstructed from publicly available information and my own knowledge of how Morrison's systems worked. I can prove that approvals were generated during times when I was documented as being out of the office. I can show that the digital signatures were created using administrative access that I had been locked out of months before the dates on the documents. I can demonstrate that the compliance reviews were conducted by external consultants while I was being told that my workload was being reduced for my own benefit. Catherine Rodriguez spent the next hour reviewing the evidence I had prepared. Technical documentation, financial analysis, regulatory framework comparisons, timeline reconstructions. Everything presented with the precision and attention to detail that had once made me one of the most respected compliance officers on Wall Street. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. "Sarah, this is extraordinary work. If your analysis is correct, James Morrison has created a scheme that would not only violate numerous federal regulations but would also constitute conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and potentially money laundering depending on how the network is ultimately used." "There's more," I said. "The European merger that was announced this week will require massive capital transfers through the offshore network. Within 60 days, money will start flowing through these structures in patterns that will trigger every compliance alert in the system. When that happens, the evidence will be undeniable. Unless Morrison finds a way to suppress the alerts or manipulate the compliance framework. I smiled for the first time in months. He can't. The system I built has safeguards that prevent manipulation, even by someone with administrative access. The only way to stop the alerts would be to completely rebuild the compliance framework, which would take months and would itself trigger regulatory scrutiny. Catherine Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across her desk. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would define her career. If you're still here, you're different from the rest. Hit subscribe and like, this story is about to explode. Sarah, what you're describing would be one of the largest financial fraud investigations the SEC has undertaken in decades. Taking on James Morrison at the height of his success and influence would require enormous resources, perfect evidence, and absolute certainty about our case. I understand. But if he's done what you believe he's done, if he's used your reputation and expertise to provide cover for a massive regulatory avoidance scheme, then he's not just committing financial crimes. He's attacking the integrity of the entire regulatory system that protects investors and markets. She stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the financial district where James Morrison's empire continued to grow and prosper. I'm going to need everything you've got, she said finally. Every document, every analysis, every piece of evidence you've collected. And I'm going to need your complete cooperation as a witness and consultant throughout the investigation. You have it. This won't be easy, Sarah. Morrison has resources and connections that most people can only imagine. He'll fight back, and he'll use every weapon at his disposal to protect himself and discredit you. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the past 18 months. The isolation, the humiliation, the systematic destruction of everything I had built. The nights spent wondering if I would ever have a professional life again, if I would ever be more than a cautionary tale whispered about in corporate boardrooms. Catherine, James Morrison already destroyed my life once. The difference now is that I understand what kind of war I'm fighting, and I have weapons he doesn't know I possess. What weapons? I smiled, and for the first time since that night at Le Bernardin, I felt like myself again. Not the defeated, humiliated woman James Morrison thought he had created, but the person who had built compliance systems so thorough that they could trap even the man who thought he controlled them. I built the system he's trying to manipulate. Which means I know exactly how to make it destroy him. The investigation that would ultimately destroy James Morrison began quietly, with Catherine Rodriguez assembling a team of prosecutors and investigators who specialized in complex financial fraud cases. But the real work happened in conference rooms and secure offices, where teams of analysts began dissecting the offshore network I had identified and tracing the connections between shell companies, international partnerships, and the compliance framework that was supposed to provide oversight. I became an unofficial consultant to the investigation, spending long days explaining the technical details of the systems I had built and how they could be used to identify and document violations. It was challenging, satisfying work that reminded me why I had chosen compliance as a career in the first place. Not just to prevent fraud, but to protect the integrity of financial markets and the investors who trusted them with their life savings. But the most important part of the investigation was also the most delicate. We had to wait for James Morrison to actually use the offshore network in ways that would generate the evidence we needed to build an airtight case against him. That opportunity came sooner than we expected. The European merger required regulatory approval from authorities in multiple countries, a process that typically takes 6 to 8 months. But James Morrison was impatient. He had built his offshore network specifically to expedite complex international transactions, and he was eager to demonstrate its capabilities to the financial world. 3 weeks after the merger was announced, Morrison Financial began moving money through the offshore network in preparation for the final deal closure. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, were restructured through partnerships in Switzerland, and emerged as investment capital in Singapore. Every transaction triggered alerts in the compliance framework I had built. Within days, Catherine Rodriguez's team had documentation of activities that violated multiple federal regulations. Money laundering statutes, securities fraud provisions, international banking regulations. The offshore network that James Morrison had thought would provide perfect cover for his activities had instead created a comprehensive record of his violations. But we still needed more. Financial violations, even serious ones, might result in fines and regulatory sanctions. To truly destroy James Morrison, to ensure that he could never again use his wealth and influence to harm innocent people, we needed evidence of the personal crimes he had committed. The conspiracy, the fraud, the deliberate use of my reputation and expertise to provide cover for illegal activities. That evidence came from an unexpected source. Margaret Chen. No relation to me despite the shared surname, but a senior administrative assistant who had worked at Morrison Financial for 12 years. She had been present at meetings, had access to correspondence, had witnessed conversations that provided crucial context for the technical violations we had identified. More importantly, she had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the activities she had been asked to facilitate. The backdated documents, the forged approvals, the careful coordination between James Morrison and external consultants who were helping to circumvent the compliance framework. Catherine Rodriguez's team approached Margaret Chen carefully, understanding that her cooperation would be essential to building a case that went beyond technical violations to establish personal culpability for James Morrison's crimes. The conversation took place in a secure conference room at the SEC, with Margaret Chen's attorney present and full immunity agreements already prepared. What she told us over the course of 6 hours of testimony provided the final pieces we needed to understand the true scope of James Morrison's scheme. He called Sarah his insurance policy, Margaret testified. He said that having someone with her reputation for integrity building the compliance framework would provide perfect cover when the time came to work around regulatory constraints. Did he specifically discuss using Ms. Chen's digital signature without her knowledge? Multiple times. He had meetings with the IT consultants about how to generate approvals that would appear to come from Sarah even after she was no longer with the company. He was very specific that the documentation had to be perfect, that no one could ever prove the approvals were generated without her knowledge. What about the offshore network itself? Mr. Morrison described it as a regulatory arbitrage opportunity. He said that by moving money through multiple jurisdictions, they could take advantage of gaps in international oversight while technically complying with the laws of each individual country. Did he express any concerns about the legality of these activities? Margaret Chen was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with the implications of what she was about to say. He said that the beauty of the plan was that even if regulators eventually caught on, Sarah would be the one held responsible. Her digital signature was on all the approvals, her compliance framework was being used to legitimize the activities. She would be the obvious target for any investigation. The room was silent as the full scope of James Morrison's plan became clear. He hadn't just been trying to circumvent regulations. He had been deliberately constructing a scheme that would destroy me if it was ever discovered, using my own reputation and expertise as both cover and shield for activities I had never known about. There's one more thing, Margaret Chen said, her voice barely above a whisper. Last week, after the merger announcement, Mr. Morrison received a call from someone at the SEC asking routine questions about the compliance framework. Nothing serious, just standard due diligence related to the merger approval process. How did he respond? He seemed pleased. He said that if regulators were asking questions about compliance, it meant the framework was working exactly as intended. But then he said something that bothered me. What? He said that if the investigation went any further, they would discover that Sarah Chen had approved activities she should never have approved, and that her emotional instability following her termination would make her an unreliable witness to whatever she thought she remembered about her work at Morrison Financial. Catherine Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression intense. Did he elaborate on what he meant by emotional instability? He mentioned that he had been in contact with Sarah's family, expressing concerns about her mental health. He said he had documentation of erratic behavior, questionable judgment, and what appeared to be paranoid delusions about being set up or framed for something. I felt sick. James Morrison hadn't just been destroying my professional reputation. He had been systematically undermining my credibility as a witness, creating a narrative about emotional instability and paranoid behavior that would make it impossible for me to defend myself against the charges he was prepared to file against me. But there was something else in Margaret Chen's testimony, something that James Morrison couldn't possibly have anticipated. Did Mr. Morrison keep records of these activities? Catherine Rodriguez asked. Everything was documented. He was obsessive about maintaining records of every meeting, every decision, every conversation related to the offshore network. He said that when the activities eventually came to light, perfect documentation would be essential to proving that everything had been properly reviewed and approved through appropriate compliance channels. Perfect documentation. James Morrison's obsession with covering himself had created the very evidence we needed to prove his crimes. Every meeting where he discussed using my reputation without my knowledge, every conversation about generating false approvals, every decision to manipulate the compliance framework I had built. All of it documented in his own files. The raid on Morrison Financial's offices took place on a Thursday morning, 6 months after my first meeting with Catherine Rodriguez. Federal agents executed search warrants simultaneously at the company's Manhattan headquarters, James Morrison's personal offices, and the homes of 3 senior executives who had been involved in constructing the offshore network. I wasn't present for the raid, but Catherine Rodriguez described it to me later. Agents seizing computers, files, and documents. Employees standing around in confusion as their workplace was transformed into a crime scene. James Morrison himself watching from his office window as boxes of evidence were loaded into government vehicles. But the most satisfying detail was something the agents discovered in James Morrison's personal safe. A file labeled Sarah Chen, Contingency Planning. It contained copies of every document related to his plan to use me as a fall guy, every conversation about manipulating my digital signature, every strategy for discrediting me if I ever tried to expose his activities. He had documented his own conspiracy in obsessive detail. The indictment was unsealed 3 weeks later. 18 federal charges against James Morrison, ranging from securities fraud to money laundering to conspiracy to obstruct justice. But the most serious charges were the ones that carried personal liability, using my identity and reputation to facilitate crimes, generating false approvals in my name, and constructing a scheme specifically designed to frame me for activities I had never approved. The financial press coverage was devastating. Morrison Financial Chief indicted in massive fraud scheme. Offshore network used compliance officer's identity without knowledge. Former employee's reputation used as cover for international money laundering. But the story that mattered most appeared in the Wall Street Journal the morning after the indictment was announced. Compliance officer turned whistleblower, how Sarah Chen exposed billion-dollar fraud scheme. For the first time in 3 years, my name appeared in print in connection with success rather than failure. I was no longer the compliance officer who had been quietly terminated for performance issues. I was the whistleblower who had uncovered one of the most sophisticated financial fraud schemes in decades. Phone calls began coming within hours of the article's publication. Recruiters who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly eager to discuss opportunities. Former colleagues who had avoided me during my professional exile, now wanting to reconnect and express their admiration for my courage in exposing James Morrison's crimes. The rehabilitation of my reputation was swift and complete, but I took no satisfaction in it. Because I knew that James Morrison wasn't finished fighting, and that his desperation would make him more dangerous than ever. The trial of James Morrison began 8 months after the indictment was unsealed, in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan that had seen some of the most significant financial crime prosecutions in American history. The government's case was built around the evidence I had helped identify and the testimony of witnesses like Margaret Chen, who had observed Morrison's activities from inside his organization. But Morrison's defense team, led by one of the most expensive white-collar criminal attorneys in the country, had a different strategy. It was a brilliant defense strategy that turned my own expertise against me. Who better to manipulate a compliance framework than the person who had built it? Who would have better access to the systems and knowledge necessary to create false evidence? And who would have a stronger motive for revenge against James Morrison than the employee he had been forced to terminate for legitimate business reasons? Catherine Rodriguez prepared me for weeks before my testimony, helping me understand how the defense would try to discredit me and what evidence we had to counter their attacks. But she was honest about the challenges we faced. "Sarah, they're going to try to put you on trial instead of James Morrison. They're going to suggest that you're unstable, vindictive, and technically sophisticated enough to have manipulated the evidence. We have strong documentation to counter their claims, but ultimately, the jury will have to decide whether they believe your version of events or theirs." What's our strongest evidence? Margaret Chen's testimony about Morrison's planning meetings. The documentation he kept of his own conspiracy. The technical analysis showing that approvals were generated at times when you can prove you weren't in the office. But most importantly, the offshore network itself. Morrison created a sophisticated scheme that generated exactly the kind of violations you predicted it would generate. That's not something you could have manipulated after the fact. The day of my testimony, I wore the same navy blue Armani suit I had worn to celebrate my first successful year at Morrison Financial. Not as a symbol of my past success, but as a reminder of the woman I had been before James Morrison taught me that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. The courtroom was packed with reporters, financial industry observers, and Morrison Financial employees who had come to see the culmination of a case that had dominated business news for months. James Morrison sat at the defense table, looking older and more tired than when I had last seen him, but still projecting the kind of confidence that had made him one of the most powerful men on Wall Street. Catherine Rodriguez led me through my testimony carefully, establishing my credentials, my history with Morrison Financial, and my role in building the compliance framework that had ultimately exposed Morrison's crimes. We covered the technical details of the offshore network, the evidence showing that my digital signature had been used without my knowledge, and the timeline that proved Morrison's activities had been planned long before my departure from the company. But the real test came during cross-examination, when Morrison's attorney began his systematic attempt to destroy my credibility. "Ms. Chen, isn't it true that you were terminated from Morrison Financial for performance issues?" I was asked to resign because I refused to approve activities that I believed violated federal regulations. "But you were told that your work was unsatisfactory, that your judgment had been questioned by senior management." I was told that my approach to compliance was too rigid for the activities the company wanted to pursue. Activities that you now claim were illegal, but that you had no direct knowledge of at the time of your departure. This was the crucial question. The defense needed to establish that I couldn't have known about the offshore network at the time I was terminated, because that would support their theory that I had discovered it later and used my knowledge to manufacture false evidence against Morrison. I discovered the offshore network through research I conducted after my departure. But the compliance framework I built while I was employed at Morrison Financial was specifically designed to detect and flag the kind of activities that network was created to facilitate. So you're asking this jury to believe that you built a system that would catch violations you didn't know were being planned? I built a system that would catch any violations, regardless of who was planning them or when they occurred. The cross-examination continued for 3 hours, with Morrison's attorney attacking every aspect of my testimony, my motivations, my technical knowledge, and my mental state. But Catherine Rodriguez had prepared me well, and I was able to respond to each attack with specific evidence and clear explanations. The turning point came when Morrison's attorney made a critical error. In trying to establish that I had been emotionally unstable following my termination, he asked me to describe my state of mind during the months after I left Morrison Financial. "I was devastated," I said honestly. I had trusted James Morrison completely, and learning that he had been planning to use me as a scapegoat for illegal activities was the most painful professional experience of my life. But being devastated didn't make me delusional. It made me determined to understand what had really happened and to ensure that he couldn't do to anyone else what he had done to me. "So your testimony here today is motivated by a desire for revenge?" Catherine Rodriguez stood to object, but I answered before she could speak. "My testimony here today is motivated by a desire for justice. Not just for myself, but for every investor who trusted Morrison Financial with their money, every employee who believed they were working for an ethical company, and every compliance officer who has ever tried to do the right thing only to discover that their work was being used to provide cover for the very violations they were trying to prevent. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then James Morrison's attorney asked the question that would ultimately destroy his client's defense. Ms. Chen, if your allegations are true, if James Morrison really did plan to frame you for these violations, why would he have kept such detailed records of his own conspiracy? I looked directly at James Morrison for the first time since entering the courtroom, and smiled. Because he's arrogant. Because he believed he was smarter than everyone else, including me. Because he thought that perfect documentation would protect him from regulatory scrutiny, and he never imagined that the same documentation would be used to prove his guilt. And because he made the same mistake that destroys every criminal who thinks they're too clever to get caught, he documented his own crimes. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, James Morrison was found guilty on 16 of 18 charges, including conspiracy to commit securities fraud, money laundering, and using my identity to facilitate criminal activities. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay restitution of $47 million to investors who had been harmed by his activities. Morrison Financial was placed under federal oversight and eventually dissolved, with its assets distributed to creditors and fraud victims. But the most satisfying part of James Morrison's downfall wasn't the prison sentence or the financial penalties. It was watching him realize, in that moment when the verdict was read, that his perfect plan had been destroyed by the very person he had tried to use as his shield. He had created his own nemesis, armed her with intimate knowledge of his systems and methods, and then given her 2 years to prepare for war. He had turned his most trusted compliance officer into his most dangerous enemy, and then been arrogant enough to believe that his wealth and influence would protect him from the consequences. 6 months after James Morrison began serving his prison sentence, I received an offer to join the Securities and Exchange Commission as a senior investigator specializing in complex financial fraud. The job would involve working with Catherine Rodriguez's team to identify and prosecute sophisticated schemes like the one that had nearly destroyed my life. I accepted immediately. My first case involved a hedge fund manager who had been using a network of shell companies to manipulate stock prices while providing investors with false performance reports. The techniques were different from James Morrison's offshore network, but the fundamental strategy was the same: use technical complexity and regulatory gaps to hide illegal activities while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations. It took us 8 months to build the case, but the indictment included 23 federal charges and resulted in the largest financial fraud conviction in SEC history. The manager received a 15-year prison sentence and was ordered to pay restitution of over $200 million. The investigation methods I had developed while researching Morrison's activities proved invaluable in identifying sophisticated fraud schemes. My experience as both a compliance officer and a victim gave me insights that traditional investigators often missed. I understood not just how these schemes worked, but how they felt to the people who were betrayed by them. Over the next 5 years, I was involved in prosecutions that resulted in over $3 billion in criminal penalties and restitution. Financial magazines began calling me the whistleblower's whistleblower, someone who specialized in cases where company insiders had been manipulated or framed by the very people they trusted. But the work was about more than just prosecuting criminals. It was about protecting the integrity of financial markets and ensuring that people who tried to do the right thing wouldn't be destroyed by those who saw their integrity as a weakness to be exploited. 7 years after James Morrison's conviction, I received a letter at my office at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The return address was a federal prison in Pennsylvania, and I knew immediately who had sent it. James Morrison had served 2/3 of his sentence and was eligible for early release based on good behavior and participation in prison education programs. The letter was part of what his parole application described as making amends to those harmed by his criminal activities. I almost threw the letter away without reading it. I had no interest in James Morrison's attempts at redemption or his efforts to secure early release from prison. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the envelope. The letter was handwritten, 3 pages long, and unlike anything I had expected from the man who had tried to destroy my life. "Sarah," it began, "I know you have no reason to believe anything I say, and I'm not writing this letter because I expect forgiveness or because I think apologies can undo the harm I caused. I'm writing because I need you to understand something that wasn't said during the trial, something that might matter to you even if it doesn't matter to anyone else. You were right about everything. Not just about the offshore network or the compliance violations, but about what kind of person I am and what I was willing to do to people who trusted me. But you were wrong about one thing. I didn't hire you because I saw you as the perfect fall guy for future crimes. I hired you because I genuinely believed in your vision for ethical compliance and sustainable business practices. The plan to use you as a scapegoat didn't develop until much later, when I realized that the compliance framework you had built was too thorough, too effective to allow for the kind of regulatory flexibility I thought I needed. By then, I was too invested in the offshore network to abandon it, and too afraid of the consequences to find a legal way forward. That doesn't excuse what I did to you. Nothing excuses it. But I want you to know that the betrayal wasn't planned from the beginning. It was the result of cowardice, greed, and arrogance that developed over time until I became someone I no longer recognized. I've had 7 years to think about the choices I made and the people I hurt. You weren't my only victim, but you were the one who fought back, who refused to let me destroy you, who turned my own weapons against me. In a way, you saved not just yourself but everyone who might have been harmed if I had been allowed to continue. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that your courage changed my life as much as my crimes changed yours. I will spend whatever years I have left trying to become someone worthy of the respect you once had for me, even if I never succeed. I know you're working for the SEC now, prosecuting people like the person I became. I hope that work gives you the satisfaction that our partnership should have provided but never could. James Morrison. I read the letter 3 times before filing it away in my desk drawer, next to the note he had written me about family first when my mother was sick. 2 documents that represented the man I had thought I knew and the man he had actually been. I never responded to the letter, and I didn't support his application for early release. But I kept it, because it represented something important about justice and consequences and the possibility of redemption even for people who have committed unforgivable acts. James Morrison served his full sentence and was released from prison 9 years after his conviction. I never heard from him again. 10 years after walking out of Morrison Financial for the last time, I stood in front of a conference room filled with compliance officers, prosecutors, and financial industry executives. I was giving a presentation about identifying sophisticated fraud schemes, using the Morrison case as an example of how technical complexity and regulatory gaps could be exploited by criminals while providing cover for their activities. The presentation was part of a conference on financial ethics and regulatory oversight, the kind of event that I had once attended as a participant and now addressed as an expert. The audience included people from firms across the financial industry, many of whom had been following my work with the SEC and the cases I had been involved in prosecuting. But the most important part of my presentation wasn't about technical analysis or investigative methods. It was about the human element of financial crime, the way that criminals use trust and relationships to manipulate their victims and provide cover for their activities. The most dangerous financial criminals, I told the audience, aren't the ones who operate outside the system. They're the ones who embed themselves within legitimate institutions and use the trust and respect of their colleagues to provide camouflage for illegal activities. They understand that the best way to avoid detection is to make their victims complicit in their own destruction. I described the Morrison case in detail, explaining how James Morrison had used my reputation and expertise to legitimize activities I had never approved, how he had systematically isolated me from operations while positioning me to take responsibility for violations I knew nothing about. But the most important lesson from this case, I concluded, isn't about the technical methods Morrison used to hide his crimes. It's about the importance of maintaining independent oversight and never allowing personal relationships to compromise professional judgment. The compliance framework I built was effective not because it was technically sophisticated, but because it was designed to detect violations regardless of who was committing them or how much I personally trusted them. During the question and answer session that followed, a young compliance officer from a mid-sized investment firm raised her hand. Ms. Chen, how do you maintain professional skepticism when you're working with people you trust? How do you balance the need for collaboration with the need to remain independent? It was a question I had been asked many times over the years, and one that went to the heart of everything I had learned from my experience with James Morrison. Trust, I said, is essential for any functional organization. But trust in compliance work must always be conditional and verifiable. The moment you start making exceptions for people you like or respect, you create vulnerabilities that can be exploited. The systems and processes you build have to be stronger than any personal relationship, because criminals understand that the best way to compromise oversight is to compromise the people responsible for providing it. After the presentation, a woman approached me during the networking reception. She was in her early 30s, well-dressed, with the kind of determined expression I recognized from my own early career. Ms. Chen, my name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm a compliance officer at Davidson Financial, and I think I may be dealing with something similar to what you experienced at Morrison Financial. I felt a familiar chill. Over the years, I had been approached by dozens of people who suspected they were being manipulated or positioned for blame by their employers. Most of the cases involved relatively minor violations or misunderstandings. But sometimes, they involved sophisticated schemes that threatened not just individual careers but the integrity of entire financial institutions. What makes you think that? I asked. I've been excluded from major compliance reviews over the past 6 months. My access to certain systems has been restricted, always with reasonable explanations. And I've discovered approvals in my name for activities I never reviewed, transactions that seem designed to circumvent the compliance framework I built. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Isolation, manipulation, positioning for blame. The techniques that James Morrison had perfected and that I had seen repeated in case after case during my years with the SEC. Jennifer, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If you're right about what's happening, then you're in danger. Not just professionally, but potentially legally. The people who are manipulating you are probably documenting your supposed approvals while building a case that you'll be responsible for any violations that are discovered. Her face went pale. What should I do? First, document everything. Every exclusion, every system restriction, every explanation you've been given. Create a timeline of events and save it somewhere secure, outside your company's systems. Second, don't confront anyone directly about your suspicions. If you're right, then alerting them to your awareness will only accelerate whatever they're planning. Third, contact the SEC's whistleblower office. They can provide guidance and protection that you can't get from within your company. I handed her my business card. Call me next week. I'll connect you with the right people and help you understand what evidence you'll need to protect yourself. 6 months later, Davidson Financial was under federal investigation for a complex scheme involving cryptocurrency transactions that violated multiple banking regulations. Jennifer Walsh, with our help, had documented how her digital signature had been used to approve activities she had never reviewed, and how senior management had systematically excluded her from oversight while positioning her to take responsibility for violations. The case resulted in criminal charges against 3 Davidson Financial executives and regulatory sanctions that ultimately led to the firm's closure. Jennifer Walsh became a federal witness and, eventually, an investigator with the SEC specializing in cryptocurrency fraud. It was the same pattern I had seen dozens of times. Criminals who thought they could use compliance officers as shields for their illegal activities, only to discover that their victims were more resourceful and determined than they had anticipated. But not all the cases I worked on had such clear outcomes. 3 years ago, I was approached by a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York about a case that would challenge everything I thought I understood about financial fraud and professional betrayal. The case involved Marcus Webb, the chief financial officer of Titan Industries, one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates in the world. Webb had been with Titan for 15 years, rising through the ranks from junior analyst to CFO through a combination of brilliant financial insights and seemingly unshakable integrity. But according to the prosecutor, Marcus Webb had been systematically embezzling funds from Titan Industries for over 5 years, using sophisticated accounting manipulations and offshore transfers to steal nearly $200 million from company accounts. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Forged documents, manipulated financial reports, complex transactions that moved money through shell companies and international partnerships. Webb had access to every system, approval authority for major financial transactions, and the technical knowledge necessary to hide his activities from auditors and regulators. But something about the case bothered me. The scheme was too obvious, too easily discovered once investigators began looking for it. For someone with Webb's intelligence and experience, the methods were surprisingly crude, almost as if he had wanted to be caught. I spent weeks reviewing the evidence with the prosecution team, looking for the sophisticated techniques and careful planning that I had learned to recognize in complex fraud cases. But instead of finding evidence of brilliant criminal planning, I found patterns that suggested manipulation and positioning. Webb had been systematically excluded from certain financial operations over the past year, with his responsibilities transferred to external consultants. His access to key systems had been restricted, supposedly to reduce his workload and allow him to focus on strategic planning. And most importantly, his digital signature had been used to approve transactions during times when he could prove he had been out of the office or attending meetings with dozens of witnesses. It was the Morrison pattern all over again. I requested a meeting with Marcus Webb's defense attorney, against the advice of the prosecution team. What I learned during that meeting changed the entire direction of the investigation. Webb's attorney produced evidence that his client had been growing suspicious about irregularities in Titan's financial operations for months before the investigation began. He had been asking questions about transactions he hadn't approved, requesting reviews of activities he had been excluded from, and growing increasingly concerned that he was being positioned to take responsibility for violations he knew nothing about. More damaging to the prosecution's case, Webb had been secretly documenting his exclusion from operations and his attempts to understand what was happening to the company's finances. He had contemporaneous notes, emails, and recordings that showed he had been trying to investigate potential fraud, not commit it. The real criminals, it turned out, were the external consultants who had been brought in to assist with financial operations. A team of specialists who had systematically gained access to Titan's systems, manipulated financial records, and used Webb's identity and authority to approve transactions that diverted money to accounts they controlled. Webb had discovered the scheme and was preparing to expose it when the consultants realized their activities were being investigated. Their solution was elegant and devastating: frame Webb for the very crimes they were committing, using his own authority and reputation to provide cover while positioning him to take responsibility for their activities. The case took 2 years to resolve, but ultimately resulted in criminal charges against 7 individuals who had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated corporate fraud schemes in history. Marcus Webb was cleared of all charges and eventually received a commendation from the SEC for his efforts to expose the fraud. But the case taught me something important about the evolution of financial crime. The techniques that James Morrison had used against me were no longer unique or unusual. They had become part of a playbook that sophisticated criminals used to manipulate compliance officers, financial executives, and other professionals who were positioned to detect and prevent fraud. Which brings us to 9 days ago, and the reason I'm telling you this story. I was testifying before a congressional committee about the need for stronger whistleblower protections and regulatory oversight of complex financial schemes. The hearing room was packed with representatives from financial institutions, regulatory agencies, and advocacy organizations who had come to discuss the lessons learned from recent high-profile fraud cases. During my testimony, I described the patterns I had observed in dozens of investigations over the past decade. The systematic isolation of compliance officers, the manipulation of digital signatures, the use of external consultants to circumvent internal oversight. I explained how these techniques were becoming more common and more sophisticated, and why traditional regulatory approaches were often inadequate to detect and prevent them. But the most important part of my testimony was a warning about what I saw as an emerging threat to the integrity of financial markets. The criminals we're dealing with today, I told the committee, aren't just stealing money or manipulating stock prices. They're attacking the very foundations of financial oversight by turning the people responsible for preventing fraud into unwitting accomplices in their own crimes. They understand that the best way to avoid detection is to make their victims complicit while keeping them ignorant. After my testimony, I was approached by a staff member from the committee who handed me a business card and a brief note. Ms. Chen, I represent someone who believes they may be experiencing the kind of manipulation you described in your testimony. They would like to speak with you confidentially about their situation. The matter involves significant financial institutions and may require federal investigation. The business card belonged to a law firm in Washington, D.C., that specialized in representing corporate whistleblowers. The kind of firm that handled cases involving billions of dollars and the highest levels of financial and political power. I called the number that evening. Ms. Chen, thank you for calling. My client is a senior executive at Morrison Financial Group. Morrison Financial Group. The company that James Morrison had built, that had been reorganized under federal oversight following his conviction, that had supposedly been reformed to prevent the kind of fraud that had nearly destroyed my life. I thought Morrison Financial was dissolved, I said. The original company was dissolved, but the assets were reorganized under new management and federal oversight. It's now one of the most closely regulated financial institutions in the country, with compliance frameworks based on the systems you originally designed. What does your client believe is happening? They believe that senior management is systematically circumventing the compliance framework using techniques very similar to those described in your testimony. External consultants, manipulated approvals, complex offshore transactions that avoid regulatory oversight. But this time, the scheme involves contracts worth over $200 million and appears to have connections to international money laundering operations. I felt the familiar chill of recognition. Someone was using my own compliance framework, the systems I had built to prevent exactly this kind of fraud, to provide cover for activities that would make James Morrison's offshore network look like a minor accounting irregularity. Why is your client coming to me instead of going directly to federal authorities? Because they believe they're being positioned as the fall guy for the scheme. Their digital signature has been used to approve activities they never reviewed, they've been systematically excluded from oversight operations, and they've been told that concerns about their judgment and emotional stability are being documented by senior management. The Morrison playbook, refined and perfected over the decades since James Morrison's conviction. Someone had studied his techniques, learned from his mistakes, and created an even more sophisticated version of the scheme that had nearly destroyed my life. I need to meet with your client, I said. They'll be in New York tomorrow. Can you meet at my office at 2 o'clock? I'll be there. The law office was on the 40th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, with windows that looked out over the financial district where I had built my career, lost it, and ultimately found redemption. The client was waiting in a conference room, and when I saw her, I understood why she had requested my help. She was me, 15 years younger. The same determined expression, the same combination of intelligence and integrity that had made me both valuable and vulnerable to someone like James Morrison. The same belief that doing the right thing would be enough to protect her from people who saw righteousness as weakness. Ms. Chen, my name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm the Senior Compliance Officer at Morrison Financial Group. And I think someone is trying to destroy my life using the same techniques that were used against you. She spent the next 2 hours describing a pattern of manipulation and positioning that was so similar to my own experience that it felt like listening to a recording of my own story. The gradual isolation from operations, the transfer of responsibilities to external consultants, the discovery of approvals in her name for activities she had never reviewed. But there were differences that made her situation even more dangerous than mine had been. The activities she was being blamed for involved not just regulatory violations but potential connections to international terrorism financing. The offshore network that was being constructed using her compliance framework wasn't just designed to avoid taxes or circumvent banking regulations, but to move money for organizations that were considered threats to national security. Rebecca, I said when she finished her story, if you're right about what's happening, then you're not just facing professional destruction or criminal charges. You're potentially looking at terrorism-related offenses that could result in decades in federal prison. I know, she said quietly. That's why I need your help. I need someone who understands how these schemes work and how to fight back against people who have unlimited resources and no moral constraints. What evidence do you have? She opened a briefcase and removed documents that looked disturbingly familiar. Technical analysis of digital signatures, timeline reconstructions, system access logs that showed approvals being generated during times when she could prove she had been elsewhere. I've been documenting everything for the past 6 months, ever since I realized what was happening. I know who's behind it, I know how they're manipulating the compliance framework, and I know what they're planning to do to me when the scheme is exposed. Who's behind it? Rebecca Martinez looked at me with an expression that mixed fear, determination, and something that might have been relief at finally being able to share the burden she had been carrying. The new CEO of Morrison Financial Group. A man named David Chen. The name hit me like a physical blow. David Chen. My own brother, who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years following a family dispute over our mother's care during her final illness. My brother, who had built a successful career in international banking, who had been recruited to lead the reorganized Morrison Financial Group because of his reputation for integrity and his supposed immunity to the kind of corruption that had destroyed James Morrison. My brother, who apparently had learned everything James Morrison had taught me about trust, betrayal, and the systematic destruction of people who stood in the way of enormous profits. If you want more shocking revenge stories like this, subscribe now and join the journey. The meeting ended with Rebecca Martinez agreeing to wear a recording device to document her interactions with my brother and the other executives who were manipulating her. Within a week, we had evidence of conspiracy to commit financial fraud, terrorism financing, and the deliberate framing of a compliance officer for activities she had never approved. The investigation that followed was swift and devastating. Federal agents raided Morrison Financial Group's offices, seized computers and documents, and arrested 7 individuals including David Chen. The charges ranged from money laundering to providing material support to terrorist organizations to conspiracy to obstruct justice. But the most serious charges were the ones that carried personal liability for using Rebecca Martinez's identity and reputation to facilitate crimes she knew nothing about. The same charges that had destroyed James Morrison, now being used to prosecute the man who had taken his place and learned to perfect his techniques. The trial lasted 6 months. David Chen was convicted on 12 federal charges and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Morrison Financial Group was permanently dissolved, its assets seized and distributed to victims of terrorism financing operations that had been funded through the network my brother had constructed. Rebecca Martinez was cleared of all charges and eventually joined my team at the SEC, where she now specializes in investigating sophisticated compliance manipulation schemes. But the most satisfying part of my brother's downfall wasn't the prison sentence or the financial penalties. It was the moment during his sentencing when the judge read a statement I had submitted describing the impact his crimes had on victims of financial fraud and their families. David Chen's actions, the judge read, represent not just a violation of federal law but a betrayal of the trust placed in him by regulators, investors, and his own family. He used techniques perfected by previous criminals to manipulate and frame an innocent compliance officer while facilitating activities that threatened national security. His crimes were made possible by his intimate knowledge of the very systems designed to prevent such activities, systems built by someone whose trust he exploited for personal gain. David Chen looked at me from across the courtroom as the judge read my statement, and I saw in his eyes the same recognition I had seen in James Morrison's eyes years earlier. The realization that his perfect plan had been destroyed by someone he had underestimated, someone whose expertise he had tried to use against them but who had ultimately turned that knowledge into a weapon for their own destruction. Today, 15 years after I first walked into Morrison Financial Group as an idealistic compliance officer who believed that doing the right thing was enough to protect her from those who would exploit her integrity, I understand something fundamental about justice and revenge and the price of trusting people who see trust as a weakness. Revenge, real revenge, isn't about destroying your enemies in a moment of passion or anger. It's about understanding them so completely that you can use their own weapons against them. It's about being patient enough to wait for the perfect moment when their success makes them vulnerable and their arrogance blinds them to the dangers they've created. James Morrison thought he was hiring the perfect fall guy when he recruited me to build a compliance framework he could manipulate. What he actually did was train his own destroyer, someone who would spend years learning to turn his techniques against him. My brother thought he was perfecting Morrison's methods when he recruited Rebecca Martinez to provide cover for activities even more sophisticated and dangerous than anything Morrison had attempted. What he actually did was repeat Morrison's fundamental error, underestimating the intelligence, determination, and resourcefulness of the people he was trying to manipulate. But the most important lesson I've learned from 15 years of fighting financial fraud isn't about investigative techniques or legal strategies. It's about the importance of maintaining your integrity even when you're surrounded by people who see integrity as a tool to be exploited. The compliance frameworks I built, the systems that ultimately destroyed both James Morrison and my brother, worked not because they were technically sophisticated but because they were designed by someone who genuinely believed in their purpose. They caught violations because they were built to catch violations, regardless of who was committing them or how much power they wielded. Trust, I've learned, must be earned and continuously verified. But integrity is something you maintain for yourself, not for the people who claim to value it. And sometimes, the greatest revenge against those who try to destroy you is simply refusing to let them succeed, continuing to do the right thing even when the right thing is difficult, expensive, and personally dangerous. 3 months ago, I received a letter from federal prison. Not from James Morrison this time, but from David Chen, my brother, serving the 3rd year of his 18-year sentence. The letter was shorter than Morrison's had been, but it contained something I had never expected to receive from the brother who had tried to destroy an innocent woman using techniques he had learned from studying my own destruction. Sarah, it read, I know you will never forgive me for what I tried to do to Rebecca Martinez, and I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I'm writing to tell you that you were right about everything. About the importance of integrity, about the danger of compromising principles for profit, about the inevitable consequences of treating other people as disposable assets in pursuit of personal gain. I studied James Morrison's techniques not because I admired him, but because I thought I could improve on his methods and avoid his mistakes. What I failed to understand was that his real mistake wasn't in the execution of his plan, but in choosing you as his target. He created an enemy who was smarter, more determined, and more ethical than he was. And then I made the same mistake by targeting Rebecca Martinez, someone you had trained to recognize and fight back against exactly the kind of manipulation I was attempting. You didn't just destroy Morrison and me. You created a system for identifying and prosecuting people like us, and you trained the next generation of compliance officers to be immune to the techniques we used against you. In trying to destroy you, we actually made you more powerful and more dangerous to people who would exploit the financial system for personal gain. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that your work at the SEC has changed the industry in ways that neither Morrison nor I could have anticipated. You turned your own victimization into a weapon for protecting others, and that's a form of revenge that's more complete and more meaningful than anything Morrison or I could have imagined. I will spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of being called your brother again, though I know I will probably never succeed. David. I filed the letter away with Morrison's letter and the note he had written me about family first during my mother's illness. 3 documents that represented the complexity of human nature, the possibility of change, and the importance of maintaining hope even for people who have committed terrible acts. Today, I lead the SEC's Financial Fraud Task Force, a team of investigators and prosecutors who specialize in the kind of sophisticated schemes that almost destroyed my life. We've been involved in cases that have resulted in over $15 billion in criminal penalties and restitution, and we've created new investigative techniques that are used by financial regulators around the world. But more importantly, we've created training programs for compliance officers that teach them to recognize the warning signs of manipulation and positioning. We've developed protocols for protecting whistleblowers who come forward with evidence of fraud, and we've built systems that make it much more difficult for criminals to use legitimate professionals as shields for their illegal activities. The work is challenging, often frustrating, and sometimes dangerous. Financial criminals with billions of dollars at stake will use every weapon at their disposal to protect themselves and destroy anyone who threatens them. But it's also the most meaningful work I've ever done, because it's built on the foundation of my own experience with betrayal and the understanding that the best way to prevent future victims is to ensure that current criminals face consequences that are swift, severe, and absolutely certain. 6 months ago, I was approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of the Morrison case and its aftermath. She was particularly interested in the personal dimension of financial fraud, the way that criminals use relationships and trust to manipulate their victims, and the psychological impact of discovering that someone you trusted completely was actually planning your destruction. During our interviews, she asked me a question that I've been thinking about ever since. Sarah, if you could go back 15 years and warn your younger self about what James Morrison was really like, would you do it? Would you change the path that led to everything that happened? I thought about it for a long time before answering. About the woman I had been when I first walked into Morrison Financial, full of hope and ambition and faith in the fundamental goodness of people. About the pain of betrayal, the isolation of professional exile, the years of uncertainty about whether I would ever have a meaningful career again. But I also thought about Rebecca Martinez and the dozens of other compliance officers who had avoided destruction because they had been trained to recognize the patterns of manipulation. About the billions of dollars that had been returned to fraud victims because of investigations that used techniques developed from my own experience. About the criminals who were now serving prison sentences instead of destroying innocent people because someone had been willing to fight back against their schemes. No, I told her. I wouldn't change anything. Because the woman who walked into Morrison Financial 15 years ago needed to learn that trust without verification is dangerous, that integrity without independence is meaningless, and that sometimes the people who claim to care about you the most are the ones positioned perfectly to destroy you. She needed to learn that lesson so she could teach it to others and prevent them from experiencing the same betrayal. The documentary aired last month, and since then I've been contacted by dozens of compliance officers, financial executives, and other professionals who recognized patterns in their own careers that reminded them of the Morrison case. Some of them were dealing with minor issues that could be resolved through internal channels. Others were facing sophisticated manipulation schemes that required federal investigation. But all of them had learned something important from my story, that trust must be earned and continuously verified, that integrity is something you maintain for yourself rather than for others, and that sometimes the greatest victory over people who try to destroy you is simply refusing to let them succeed. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that their betrayal didn't just break your heart, but taught you something fundamental about the nature of human relationships and the price of believing in people who see your faith as a weapon to be used against you? I have. Twice. And both times, I learned that the best revenge against people who try to destroy you isn't destroying them in return. It's becoming someone who is immune to their techniques, who can protect others from experiencing the same betrayal, and who can turn their own methods against them when justice demands it. James Morrison called me inefficient in front of 12 directors because he thought I was an obstacle to his vision of unregulated profit and sophisticated fraud. What he didn't understand was that efficiency, in compliance work, means building systems that are too thorough and too intelligent to be manipulated by anyone, including the person who built them. 9 days after he humiliated me in that boardroom, a single clause in the compliance framework I had designed froze $200 million in contracts and began the investigation that would ultimately destroy his career, his freedom, and his legacy. The CFO didn't lie, exactly. He just underestimated the woman whose expertise he had tried to exploit, whose integrity he had seen as weakness, and whose determination to do the right thing had turned her into the most dangerous enemy he would ever face. Sometimes the most efficient revenge is simply being so good at your job that your work becomes a trap for anyone who tries to use it for purposes it was never intended to serve. And sometimes, the most complete victory over people who try to destroy you is building a career dedicated to ensuring that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a federal investigator specializing in financial fraud. And this is how I learned that patience, expertise, and an unshakable commitment to doing the right thing can be the most powerful weapons against people who see other people's trust as their greatest vulnerability. Thank you for listening. And remember, in the world of high finance, the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who operate outside the system. They're the ones who embed themselves within it and use the trust of good people to provide cover for activities that would destroy everything those good people believe in. Trust, but verify. Always verify. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a federal investigator specializing in financial fraud. And this is how I learned that patience, expertise, and an unshakable commitment to doing the right thing can be the most powerful weapons against people who see other people's trust as their greatest vulnerability. Thank you for listening. And remember, in the world of high finance, the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who operate outside the system. They're the ones who embed themselves within it and use the trust of good people to provide cover for activities that would destroy everything those good people believe in. Trust, But verify.